Our second speaker is Dr. Stephen Hyman, who's director of the Stanley Center for Psychiatric Research at the Broad Institute of Harvard University and MIT, and a distinguished service professor at Harvard. Dr. Hyman is the chair of the Institute of Medicine Forum on Neuroscience and Nervous System Disorders, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and a member of the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology. Dr. Hyman also served as director of the National Institute of Mental Health and the first faculty director of Harvard University's Mind, Brain, and Behavior Institute. He is founding president of the International Neuroethics Society and editor of the Annual Review of Neuroscience. And I was expecting Steve to say thank you for joining us at this meeting physically, but thank you for joining us virtually, and we look forward to hearing your comments.
Well, thank you very much, and I have to say, not only did I not get to join you physically, but I still had to wake up at 4 in the morning to try to get there. So I see no justice in this snow, but that's another matter. I want to take off from Mildred Solomon's presentation. In fact, I was scratching out some things I was going to say so that I could highlight areas of agreement and some modest areas of difference, not really disagreement. I think what Mildred Solomon said that I had intended to start with is that I very much agree with the need to engage scientists as a community. I find that the young scientists who I've been teaching for decades often are so deeply engaged in the intellectual and technical aspects of their work that they often do not find themselves able to lift their heads to engage in either ethical or policy reflections, or for that matter, to read a novel. Moreover, many, not all, but many scientists engage in the profession as young people do with any profession, believing that everything they're working on has largely beneficent uses. Mildred used the term transformational learning. That term seems a bit grand for me, but I do agree that teaching ethics, while it of course needs a cognitive component to give students categories within which to reflect, is certainly not enough. Indeed, 2 days ago, tragically, in many senses, a Harvard student emailed in a false alarm so that he wouldn't, for a bomb threat, so that he wouldn't have to take his final exams, and has now been arrested. What I would say with respect to the cognitive aspect of ethics, and knowing this kind of Harvard student, is I'm sure he could have gotten an A+ in any standard ethics course, but somehow he made a very problematic choice for himself and for our community. Thus, we need both cognitive and emotional engagement, and from the syllabus that I sent you from the course that I teach at Harvard, you can see there is a lot that is built around case studies, and what you can't see from that is that in sections we set up many debates, and I'm happy when students are red-faced and arguing and really engaged, because, as I've already noted, cognition is important, but cold cognition is hardly enough, because in addition to ethical frameworks, I always want to achieve, first of all, curiosity about ethical and policy concerns, and then habits of ethical reflection and worry. The curiosity is often overlooked, but I think it's very important. Mm-hmm. We require in NIH grants, for example, and I'm sure there are equivalents from other funding agencies, coursework in the responsible conduct of research, which includes traditional bioethics and issues about research misconduct. My impression, having both taught in such courses and required such courses when I was an NIH Institute director, and now thinking about additional requirements now that there is a data replication concern throughout biomedical science is that many students treat these as bitter medicine, don't take them as seriously as we would hope, and in part this attitude is conveyed by some of the principal investigators in whose labs they work, because at a time when they're learning about human subjects protections, for example, they're not doing experiments. And so I'm not here to talk about the education of mentors and principal investigators, but I think we know that just as ethically concerned medical interns and residents often become negatively socialized in the hurly-burly of a large hospital where people are well-meaning but often engage in dark humor to protect themselves from the difficulties facing them. The same kind of re-socialization away from reflection and toward really focusing on the work happens not universally, to be sure, but in many venues, and is worth attention separately. I do have one minor disagreement as a practicing scientist with what was said before, which is scientists do not always think about the purpose of their work, at least not in the deepest sense, and certainly not basic scientists. Indeed, many scientists have the ethic that their job is to uncover as much knowledge as possible and to take it wherever it leads, and even in some cases to produce technologies that may have risky uses. And too often scientists and engineers think it is somebody else's job to worry about unintended uses with possible negative consequences, and not their job. And this is precisely where we want to create both ethical reflection but also curiosity about where something might lead, not to get people to censor themselves or stop their deep exploration, which in the end is what science must do, but certainly to think about safeguards outside of the issue of neurobiology. Several recent controversies over the publication of the sequences of influenza strains and how they could be made more transmissible human to human engendered significant argument in the scientific community, some thinking that we just had to push the research as far as possible if we were ever going to understand how flu works, and others worried about synthetic biology tools becoming available even to people of malintent in their garages. And I think that debate, while decisions have been made about the existing publications, the debate is hardly finished. Let me turn to neuroethics. And I think it's important that this is not traditional bioethics, at least as I have tried to define neuroethics, not only for my students, but through the society, as I have assumed that traditional bioethics can take care of issues of research ethics, human subjects protections, and the like, when they apply, for example, to patients with dementia, with cognitive disability, and with mental illness, and other traditional well-trodden bioethical issues. They're well-trodden, even if not always matters of absolute consensus. In fact, I think that neuroethics, besides being necessary as we embark in a new era of discovery and technology, is also extremely interesting to students, because beyond what is typical of most bioethics curricula, there are very deep philosophical issues raised, which the previous speaker actually alluded to. But just to add to the list, the question of how memory works. Most of us intuitively think that memory is at least nearly veridical, that is, operating like a camcorder, and we often are quite certain that our memories are correct when we're being confronted. And yet, scientifically, we know they're not. And what does this mean for our status, for example, as moral agents? What is the issue of human identity? Again, a major issue for moral status, especially when it comes to our narrative identities. The last speaker touched on the issue of free will and moral agency. Now, of course, there's the age-old metaphysical debate engaged long before modern science, for example, by St. Augustine. But as we start to understand actual mechanisms of cognition, emotion, motivation, and become available to tamper with them either through drugs or neuromodulation, I think this will become a much sharper and more important argument. To give you an example of something like this and what happens in the classroom when you get students engaged, there are, in the course I teach, both neurobiologists and stem cell biologists, or budding stem cell biologists interested in the brain. And there are a lot of experiments now going on in animals, not yet very successful, but going on in animals, in which stem cell therapy might be used to repair a degenerating hippocampus, thus to restore memory in neurodegenerative disorders. And last year, among these very bright and able students who were able to pick apart and appropriately criticize the animal models and the methodology of these papers, no one thought about how memories are stored and how success using the technologies as we now imagine them might give your grandparent a perfectly functioning hippocampus, but would overwrite all of their memories and identities, at least those that still were hippocampal dependent. And this raises the whole question of, who is it that we're saving with these therapies? Now, once they thought about this, of course, they became very, very engaged, and it became a gateway into much deeper discussions. You could imagine the same discussion about deep brain stimulation, both as it exists now and as it's being expanded from treatment of Parkinson's disease to the treatment of obsessive-compulsive disorder, depression, and other psychiatric disorders. And also the project proposed by DARPA for the treatment of individuals with traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, but also personality disorders, potentially with deep brain stimulation or other forms of modulation, which could touch on our identities and aspects of ourselves that many people, again on reflection, don't even think have a physical basis. Of course they do, and we're going to have that illustrated. Let me just end by saying that you might think that an ethics course being offered to science concentrators would be preaching to a very small choir. In fact, when engaging issues of the kind that I've just touched on, but you can see in the syllabus, this course, at least, has been very popular at Harvard. To keep it interactive, I've tried to limit the enrollment to 75, but this year in pre-registration, there are 133 science concentrators who want to take the course. That makes me optimistic about the ability to engage budding young scientists in hopefully emotionally as well as cognitively engaging ethical reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think we will come back to the question of engaging young scientists at an early stage, and truly engaging them in interesting and challenging questions, which helps actually get the basics, in there, both cognitively and emotionally.